I'm Doug Boynton, and this is WHRO's Weekly Edition, highlighting the week's news and stories happening across the region. Another batch of great stories in this week's program. Norfolk's Planning Commission has given the okay for work to begin on the first stages of the city's downtown floodwall. CNBC recently released its annual Best States for Business list, and while both Virginia and North Carolina are in the top 5, Virginia loses its number 1 ranking. And in another installment in our Revolution Revisited series, we take a deep look into the intersection of sport and society in Colonial Virginia. It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. A new survey from Old Dominion University shows real estate professionals in Hampton Roads are cautiously optimistic about the future. WHRO's Barry Graham dives into the report.
On the Real Estate Sentiment Index, where 100 is best and 50 is neutral, Hampton Roads scored a 57. More than 100 industry insiders responded. They expressed concern about inflation, global trade, and the national economy, but felt more confident about the local market, especially in residential and commercial sectors. Positive sentiment was especially noticeable in the single-family and multifamily residential markets and was also seen in the commercial sector. Barry Graham, WHRO News.
Workers at Norfolk Botanical Garden will vote soon on forming a union. WHRO's Nick McNamara reports it's a push for better pay, a safer workplace, and more input on garden policy.
Around 70% of eligible workers signed cards calling for a vote to unionize the garden. On July 23rd, the workers will cast their ballots.
They love what they do. They sometimes get frustrated with the fact that they don't feel as if they're being heard.
That's Bridget Fitzgerald, the union organizer working with Norfolk Garden employees. Garden management said in a statement that the workers are the heart of the nearly 90-year-old nonprofit and that they respect employees' right to organize or not. Norfolk would be the second botanical garden to organize under the International Association of Machinists in Virginia. Henrico County's Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden workers organized in 2024, which inspired the push in Norfolk. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Norfolk's Planning Commission cleared the way for construction on the first piece of the city's downtown floodwall. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reported that story.
The floodwall is part of a nearly $3 billion project with the Federal Army Corps of Engineers. It's meant to protect Norfolk from catastrophic flooding during big storms. The first phase stretches along the shoreline from the Berkeley Bridge east to the Chesterfield Heights neighborhood, including Harbor Park and the future casino. The wall will range in height from about 6.5 feet to nearly 17. Kyle Spencer with the city says it won't look like the current 50-year-old floodwall downtown, which is basically a concrete slab.
It'll look mainly like an elevated walkway, bike path. It's going to have some patterns to it. And then there'll be lighting on top as well and benches so folks can take a view of the river.
The city plans to start site work this fall, like demolishing pavement and relocating utilities. Construction on the wall itself likely won't happen until 2027. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Texas has started one of the nation's largest state-funded research initiatives on psychedelics. Supporters say the drugs, which remain illegal in the United States, hold promise for treating PTSD, addiction disorders, and other health issues. As Robin Burgess reports for the American Homefront Project, there is growing interest in psychedelic research nationwide.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed legislation in June to provide up to $50 million to research ibogaine, a psychoactive compound derived from a shrub native to Central West Africa. Abbott emphasized the potential benefits for members of the military and others experiencing trauma.
Texas is home to more veterans than any other state of the United States of America. Many struggle with things like depression, PTSD, and opioid use disorder. A therapy that has shown great promise in treating those conditions is ibogaine.
Like most psychedelics, ibogaine is a Schedule I drug and illegal to use or possess in the United States. Several veterans who traveled to Mexico to undergo ibogaine therapy testified in support of the legislation. Navy veteran Brandon Bryan said he endured traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress, and other health issues.
I applied for a grant and went to Mexico for ibogaine treatment. Immediately, the night sweats and night terrors I had suffered from for years stopped. Ibogaine therapy is not a magic pill, but it is an opportunity to shift my perceptions and work on becoming the best version of myself.
Texas is among several states, Republican and Democratic controlled, that are now funding psychedelic research. And last year, the VA announced that it will fund its first psychedelic therapy study since the 1960s. Dr. Lynette Averill is a researcher at Baylor College of Medicine who is studying psilocybin therapy for veterans with PTSD.
The critical piece is not just how do we save lives to the point of sort of tolerating existence. I think the place that I'm excited about in psychedelics is that it seems there's so much more foundation to save lives and people actually build the life that they truly want to be living.
Averill says many researchers believe the long-term health effects of psychedelics may be due to their ability to stimulate new neural connections in the brain, which may help people create new ways of thinking to process their traumas and end their substance use disorders.
With psilocybin and MDMA, the FDA has already given them a breakthrough therapy designation, which said everything suggests these are as good as or better than anything we have for this particular condition. They are safe, and there's very little abuse potential.
But Averill says psychedelic therapies are also associated with cardiac and other health risks. So participants are medically evaluated to qualify for studies, and they undergo therapy to prepare for and process what they learn during their psychedelic experiences. Author Jules Evans, who has collaborated on research about psychedelics, says building a safety infrastructure is essential before treatments are rolled out to the public.
Psychedelics can lead to terrifying trips, can lead to destabilization, increased anxiety, lingering feelings of trauma.
Evans has surveyed hundreds of people who use psychedelics, both in the underground for recreation, as well as in controlled settings like retreats and clinical trials.
Post-psychedelic difficulties and adverse events seem to be lower in clinical settings. But we also need to remember that clinical trials are basically the optimum possible conditions, and that when these medicines get rolled out within the healthcare system, it's not always optimal.
It's unclear when the rollout might happen in the US, but the Food and Drug Administration is considering whether to approve certain psychedelic therapies as medically supervised treatments. MDMA and psilocybin are frontrunner candidates for FDA approval, and Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. recently told Congress the agency is working hard to expand access. I'm Robin Burgess in Austin.
This story was produced by the American Homefront Project, a public media collaboration that reports on American military life and veterans. Still ahead on Weekly Edition, a Hampton builder is constructing an apartment complex where a beloved farm and farmers market once stood. But first, Sentara Health recently changed how it conducts CAT scans to reduce plastic waste. WHRO's Catherine Hafner breaks down the process.
CT machines are basically X-rays, but the X-ray tube spins around your body to get detailed cross-sectional images. Technicians first inject patients with a dye called contrast. Diane Bruce at Sentara Norfolk General says until recently,
we would have to load a very bulky syringe every single time we had to inject someone, attach a type of tubing every time we had to inject someone, and use an individual bottle of saline.
Their new injector machines instead use bulk bottles that can serve about 5 patients before being tossed. Bruce says there's much less mess.
My trash can doesn't fill up in a day anymore.
Sentara estimates the change will cut plastic waste across the health system by about 78,000 pounds per year. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Virginia dropped to 4th place on CNBC's Best States for Business after topping the list last year. And there's a new number 1. WHRO's Ryan Murphy dives into the details.
Virginia dropped to 4th place on CNBC's Best States for Business after topping the list last year. Virginia's ranking took the biggest hit due to rising costs of doing business in the state. Virginia ranked 24th in cost of business in the nation last year. This year, the cost jumped to 31st. The state also lost ground on ratings for workforce, quality of life, and the general economy. North Carolina took the number 1 slot, with Texas and Florida rounding out the top 3. Virginia hasn't ranked outside of the top 3 since 2018. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
So what makes North Carolina number 1 on the CNBC list? WHRO's Ryan Murphy is back to break down what made the Tar Heel state a winner.
North Carolina Governor Josh Stein credited the people of his state in a conversation with CNBC.
If you are a biotech or pharmaceutical company or an aerospace company, you can come here. We have the engineers and scientists to help design your product, but we also have the talented advanced manufacturing workforce you need to produce them.
The accolade comes after the western part of the state was devastated by Hurricane Helene last fall. Flooded mountain towns there have spent the last 9 months rebuilding. The biggest gains in North Carolina's rankings came in infrastructure and the cost of living. Texas and Florida rounded out the CNBC rankings top 3, with the former number 1, Virginia, falling to 4th. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture says it wants to scrap a rule that blocks road building and logging on nearly 59 million acres of national forest. Here's more from WMRA's Randy B. Hagee.
The Hone Quarry waterfall cascades over a rocky ledge between verdant wooded slopes in the George Washington National Forest. While hiking up the trail, you enter an expanse of about 10,000 acres that has no roads. This is one patch of Virginia's 394,000 acres of inventoried roadless areas. These areas have been protected from road construction, logging, and other industrial activities since 2001, when the so-called roadless rule was implemented under the Clinton administration. In June, President Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, announced the agency's intention to get rid of this rule, quote, allowing for fire prevention and responsible timber production. The agency has said this proposed change will have to go through an environmental analysis and public input process before going into effect. Ellen Stewart Enkins is the executive director of the Virginia Wilderness Committee.
These are important and really popular recreation destinations.
The possible rescission of the roadless rule is the latest of several changes to federal land management in recent months, all in the wake of Trump's March 1st executive order calling for the expansion of American timber production. An emergency situation determination streamlined the process for activities such as commercial logging and wildfire prevention. The acting head of the Forest Service directed regional foresters to increase logging by 25% over the next 4 to 5 years. The Trump administration has imposed new limits on when and to what extent agencies have to follow environmental review processes.
If all of these initiatives were to move forward, I think it is not hyperbolic to say it would be disastrous for our national forests.
Kristen Genzier manages the Southern Environmental Law Center's program to protect Virginia's national forests.
There are hundreds of thousands of people who rely on the national forest for water, and a lot of those headwaters come out of roadless areas. It's not a coincidence that the clean water comes out of areas without roads and industry and the sedimentation that comes along with it.
For example, Hone Quarry Run, which flows into the North River, which supplies parts of Harrisonburg and Rockingham County with drinking water. I asked the U.S. Forest Service for an interview about how this rule rescission could play out in our area. A USDA spokesperson responded with an email statement. It reads, in part, the change, quote, reflects the department's commitment to President Trump's executive actions to expand American timber production and unleash American energy. Ron Jenkins, the executive director of the Virginia Loggers Association, is in favor of regional foresters having more control over the management of these lands, including areas that are set aside for recreation and conservation and those that are open to timber harvest.
We would like to see national forests managed in a way that is done by the professionals, like scientists, forest managers, ecologists, dendrologists, and silviculturalists. Having a big federal rule just doesn't do society really justice. These professionals can make some of their own decisions as to where is best with public input. I think that's very important. These folks that are hired can determine a lot on their own which types of ecosystems should be set aside and how much.
He noted that the vast majority of logging in Virginia occurs on privately owned land, about 97%, according to the most recent data available from the USDA. Part of that is because around 80% of the state's forest land is privately owned. but Jenkins sees the potential for expansion of logging on federal lands if they became easier to access. He said most loggers use the state's best management practices to preserve water quality around their tracts, and in general want to harvest the raw material for wood and paper products in a responsible way.
Most of the people we work with are very aware of their stewardship value.
Both Stuart Enkins with the Wilderness Committee and Genzier with the SCLC noted that the George Washington National Forest Land Management Plan lays out additional protections for some of these areas covered by the roadless rule. It identifies about 42% of the forest that may be suitable for timber harvest, while conserving other areas through a complex jigsaw puzzle of management categories, such as remote backcountry areas and Indiana bat hibernacula.
Many of our roadless areas in at least Virginia are roadless areas still because they're difficult to get to. So I do think we will see some more logging in these. It may be more dramatic out west.
Regarding our case study of Home Quarry, if the roadless rule goes away, that area is still currently protected from timber harvest in the Forest Management Plan because it's part of the proposed Shenandoah Mountain National Scenic Area. But the bill that would create the scenic area, co-sponsored by Virginia Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, is currently under committee review in the Senate, so that land's future remains uncertain. I'm Randy B. Hagee.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
A Hampton real estate developer is causing a stir. He got the green light to build a 4-building apartment complex where a beloved orchard and farmers market once stood. WHRO's Nick McNamara reported that story.
Several residents are concerned that more than 300 new units would strain the already traffic-choked East Mercury Boulevard. Connie Heath lives a quarter-mile west.
I just can't imagine how it's going to be for us trying to live there.
City Council on Wednesday approved the complex's special use permit and rezoned the former site of Woods Orchards to allow for high-density residential properties. The city says the project by the Whitmore Company addresses critical housing shortages and that congestion stemming from Hampton Road's bridge tunnel work should lighten by the time construction is done. A survey of residents found that 130 of 148 respondents opposed the project. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Newport News veteran Scott Sproul lives the spirit of Christmas year-round. His love for giving led him to start an organization focused on meeting needs and improving his community. Cynthia Vaca-Davis has the details for WHRO.
Sproul is the executive director of Claus Cares. Since 2021, he's been on a Santa-like mission.
Help everybody, everywhere.
The organization sponsors a range of charitable events and maintains a boutique. It's filled with new or like-new clothing and other merchandise, even pet supplies. Partnerships with places like Petco make this possible. Sproul can usually source items he doesn't have on hand.
When somebody says, hey, I need a queen bed, usually within a few hours I can find him a queen bed.
Sproul runs the charity with donations in his own goodwill, but he says he'd prefer to give the credit to another source.
I give credit to Santa.
Cynthia Vaca-Davis, WHRO News.
This week's Revolution Revisited focuses on sport and culture in Revolution-era Virginia. But not everything made the cut. WHRO's Connor Worley takes a deeper dive into the era's intersection of sport and society.
Sport and physical expression are inextricably woven into a society's culture. Sport is in and of the culture. It reflects the trends and interests. It can mirror the economic and social standing of different people groups. And sometimes, sport even acts as an agent of change. The brutal social and class conditions of colonial Virginia life were reflected in its favorite pastimes. 18th century Virginia in particular developed a large interest in horse racing. Gerald Gems, former president of the North American Society for Sport History, says upper-class families used it as a way to display wealth and maintain social status.
They would have the biggest carriages, that brought their wives and whoever else they invited to the horse race. And if you had 2 horses, it shows you had some wealth. If you had 6 horses, you had a lot more wealth.
The more extravagant your attire was at a race, the more it signified your wealth. While aristocratic whites enjoyed the opulence offered by horse racing, it was enslaved black Virginians that actually maintained, cared for, and raced the animals.
They were training the horses, they were feeding them, they were caring for them and brushing them and so forth, so they had a lot of knowledge.
That's Linda J. Borish, a professor of history at Western Michigan University.
When the masters would watch the races, often they would bid on some of the slaves who were riding them.
Jim says slaves who served as jockeys were not exempt from punishment if they lost.
So if you lost, you could blame it on your jockey, a slave, punish him if you want. You don't lose any self-esteem in losing to some other guy who you think is lower than you.
Horse racing wasn't the only sport where gambling propped up the exploitation of enslaved people. Cockfighting was a popular gambling event. Enslaved people trained the animals for fights, but the slave owners reaped all of the reward and reputation for any success. Slaves would be further exploited by forcibly competing against one another in contests.
The slaves actually learned to fight, and then they were always involved in other contests where the owners could bet on them, when things like foot races and typical things like that.
It wasn't an exclusively harsh existence. Elliot J. Gorn and Warren Goldstein write in A Brief History of American Sports that the Virginian social structure did occasionally allow black slaves to enjoy their ancestral games along with the new regional pastimes of horse racing, cockfighting, and even fox hunts. Rough and tumble wrestling provided a socially acceptable way for poor and rich white men to come together to indulge in violent tendencies. Anybody could challenge anybody for bragging rights. Borish says while it reflected violent parts of society, rural whites used it as an opportunity.
That would be a way for a rural white person to show predominantly his identity, his stand in society, because he didn't have land like the planters. He didn't have great education like many of the planters, and none of the formal aspects. But what he did have was the physical tools, and if he was insulted, he's going to wrestle and wear out one of his opponents and try to be the best in that field of competitors.
The patriarchal culture also dictated that women not participate in sport. Their role was to be supportive, sitting on the sidelines, rather than participating in horse races, wrestling, or other forms of exercise.
They were supposed to be more cooperative, so they would be in horseback riding, not horseback races, to be done specifically by women. But that doesn't mean women didn't, push the edge, because some of the women would go horseback riding or in rural areas.
It wasn't until the 1800s that the development in sport technology, team sports, and the alteration of societal norms shaped American sports into its modern form. But the spark of what sports became in America was there from the start. The sports of Colonial Virginia reflected its culture, upholding societal constraints and maintaining control for the ruling class. Connor Worley, WHRO News.
You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Ryan Murphy, Barry Graham, Catherine Hafner, Nick McNamara, and Cynthia Vaca Davis. Robin Burgess with the American Homefront Project, and WMRA's Randy B. Hagee. Thanks as always to Connor Worley, who produced today's show. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed. You can get your news updates at WHRO.org, WHRO smartphone app, and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.